All right, good morning. Hope you guys are doing well. Last day before break, before spring break here, and also our last day with Dostoevsky, at least until I ask you to write about Brothers K at the end of the semester. So we're gonna finish up with the novel and really do two things today. So we're gonna read Alyosha's speech by the stone in the last chapter of the book. It's short. We're just gonna read it and make a few final remarks about it. And then we're going to introduce George Orwell by way of two essays that I'm going to have you read over break, or you could knock them out in a half hour today, and that's what I would recommend. They're short essays, and then get ready to come back from break and get started with 1984. So that's the plan. Now, a couple last remarks about the trial. So we saw the outcome. Dmitri's convicted. There's not even any leniency with the sentence. He's given his full sentence, and that came as somewhat of a shock to people. But I really see in the trial, I've introduced you to the idea of René Girard's scapegoating mechanism, right? So mimetic rivalry and conflict gives rise to a war of all against all, more or less, and that threatens the whole existence of a community. And so all that violence and envy is directed unconsciously at a scapegoat who's usually some kind of an outsider, whether because he committed a crime or she's marginalized in some way, maybe an outsider or a foreigner. And the scapegoat is then expelled or murdered in the worst case. And that produces a kind of catharsis or a cleansing of the violent tendencies that people have, and there's peace, and so for Girard, then the victim is deified, and that's all the Greek myths in his thinking. Now you can see that going on with Dmitri in this trial, right? So he's committed, if not the murder of his father, and I don't think he did murder his father. He's ostracized himself by his kind of drunken riotousness and the way he lives. So he is an outsider, and you see the whole town gather around his trial with fascination, and everyone's caught up in it, whether they're for him or against him. And especially pay attention if you're rereading the end of the trial. Pay attention to the men who are happy to see him convicted and very glad about it. So I think Dmitri very much is that scapegoat figure for this town, and so it makes sense that he's convicted, even though the speech by the defense was far better, and the prosecution didn't have conclusive evidence, as Fetyukovich argues, to convict. And even though we know Smerdyakov tells Ivan he committed the murder, Dmitri's punished, and he's going to be punished by exile, right? He's sent to hard labor in Siberia as the sentence. So analogous to sacrificing the scapegoat or casting them out of the walled city. But it couldn't have turned out any other way if we're taking Girard at his word. So the whole town was caught up in what he calls mimetic contagion, and all that violence had to be directed somewhere. So Mitch is like a lightning rod for it, or something like that. And you saw in his trial, he's compared a little bit to Christ. Now there was one passage in the prosecutor's speech that I skipped over, and I would like to find and read, and it has to do with how Ippolit Kirillovich imagined Dmitri before he's arrested. And the description is that of a criminal who's going to be executed on his way to the gallows. And if you remember, Dostoevsky was nearly executed in the 1840s for revolutionary kind of literary activities in Tsarist Russia, and he was like next in line to be on the post for the firing squad, and at the last second their sentence was commuted, and he was sentenced to hard labor instead, like Dmitri. So he knows what it feels like to be going to your place of execution. And in every one of his great novels, his 5 great novels, to the extent that I can tell, he gives some description of a man on the way to the gallows or the way to the execution square, and they're fascinating in a morbid way, because you can tell he really knows what the mental state of someone on their way to that kind of an end is. So listen to this. This is again from the prosecutor's speech, but I had forgotten about it, and it's worth reading. Pardon me. I picture to myself the state of the criminal's soul at that time as an indisputable, slavish submission to three elements that overwhelmed it completely at first. Oh, pardon me, he's talking about Dmitri there. One can think up a lot in several hours. He felt, as I picture to myself, something similar to what a criminal feels on his way to execution, to the gallows. He still has to go down a long, long street, and at a slow pace, past thousands of people. Then turn down another street, and only at the end of that other street, the terrible square. I precisely think that at the start of the procession, the condemned man, sitting in the cart of shame, must feel precisely that there is still an endless life ahead of him. Now, however, the houses are going past. The cart is moving on. Oh, that's nothing. It's still such a long way to the turn down the second street. And so he still looks cheerfully to the right and left at those thousands of indifferently curious people whose eyes are fascinated on him, and he fancies he is still the same sort of man as they are. But here comes the turn down the other street. Oh, it's nothing, still a whole street to go. And no matter how many houses pass by, he will keep thinking there are still a lot of houses left, and so on to the very end, to the very end, to the very square. So it was then, as I pictured to myself with Karamazov. So there's the description again of condemned man in the cart on the way to the square where he's going to be executed, and it's a picture of the state of mind of a man like that, and you know it's accurate because Dostoevsky was a man like that, and again fascinating in a morbid kind of way, but it's also, that's where we're all at, right? Everyone's sort of on their way to the fatal square. It's just a matter of time. And so mortality, as we've seen, and your own mortality, as we've seen, has been a concern throughout the whole book. Like, how do you face that down and deal with it? And maybe you can say for a condemned man, it's just sort of shortened, like it's happening in a condensed time frame. Okay, so last thing on the trial then. Again, Mitch is convicted. There is an interesting idea in Christianity that Satan, right? And we've talked about this. The name Satanos in Greek means the accuser, and in Greek that word really means something like the prosecuting attorney in a trial. And if you think about how I don't know, sort of unseemly Ippolit Kirillovich was, and he's got this weird, resentful, prideful thing going on with his speech, and the public doesn't react to him well. And he's the prosecuting attorney. He's the accuser. There's perhaps something going on there. And even more interesting, in the Gospels. So think in the Gospels when Christ tells his apostles again and again that he's going to send his Holy Spirit, or he'll send another, the Holy Spirit, the advocate, the paraclete sometimes is the word you'll hear. That's kind of the opposite word to the name of Satan. To the name of the accuser. So it's parakletos in Greek, from a verb parakaleo, which means be an advocate for, in the sense of like defense attorney. And that's very interesting because that's one of the titles of the Holy Spirit, is paraclete. And Fetyakovich then, in this context, he's the defense attorney, right? He's the one who stands by and defends you against the accuser. And his speech was much better and much more wholesome, and the people loved it much more. Now, it doesn't make sense though, because he doesn't win. Mitch is convicted, and only when you think along the lines of mimetic contagion and scapegoating, I think can the trial make sense. Otherwise, it seems like a mistrial. Almost everyone is for acquittal. Even one of the judges was crying out loud, and yet he's convicted unanimously. So what's happened? The scapegoating mechanism, which is which is for Girard the true work of Satan. Okay, so you might think, okay, there's the end of the story. Does Satan win if we're using that language? Not quite. So what we skipped over, Mitch has been convicted, but Ivan has arranged his escape somewhere between their town and Siberia. Ivan's arranged for Mitya to be let off or helped, aided in his escape. Although Ivan's near death with brain fever, and we don't learn his fate, but at the end of the novel, he's bedridden and unconscious. And so it's going to fall to Katerina Ivanovna to save Ivan. And we don't have time to go into it, but there's a wonderful scene where Katerina Ivanovna visits Mitya in his hospital room because he's sick too. He's come down with a fever after the trial. And she's there, and they have a moment of reconciliation, which is very strange. And then Grushenka walks in, and all the language of the whole scene, you go read it for yourself, is all the language of mimetic rivalry and desire. A lot about hatred and love being right there and being one and the same thing. And again, we won't go into it in detail, but that's worth checking out on your own. And now, that's where we leave Mitya off. And the idea is that they're going to escape to America. He and Grushenka are going to escape to America and see what happens. And that's where the novel leaves us. Now, that's not the very end, though. The very end, and here's where I think the Satan doesn't get the last word. We end with Alyosha attending, remember Illyusha, the poor little boy whose father Mitya dragged out of the bar by his beard. He's died from his, I think he had consumption, but he's died, and so Alyosha goes to his funeral, and all the boys that Alyosha had befriended, including Kolya, they're at the funeral, and then it's after that at the stone that Illyusha and his father had been in the habit of walking to and visiting. Alyosha gives a speech to the boys, and that's the end of the novel. And that's what we're going to read in a moment. And again, it's a short speech, and I'll talk about it in a moment. But the funeral is difficult because you remember the father, Snegurov. He's a drunkard. He had been kind of thrown out of the service for corruption or bribery or something. It wasn't clear, but he's not a good guy, or in a petty way. You know, he's not a murderer, but he's kind of a petty drunkard and criminal and a bit of a buffoon. So you got him. The mother is somewhat out of her mind. The sister's spiteful because she has to be tied down to her needy family, and it's a real mess. And the funeral it's almost funny, but in a very, very sad way. The father, Snegurov, is so erratic and distraught that it almost rises into comedy, but the pathos is so great that it's not. You're coarse if you laugh at it, but it's certainly not. It's not a beautiful setting, and it's very hard on the boys. Alyosha's made friends with. They're all crying and sobbing, and most of all, they miss Illyusha because they come to be friends with him, and obviously they feel great pity for him. But it's hard to be around the father, the way he's acting, and the mother, and all of them. So it's something of a sacrifice to be there comforting the family at the funeral, I'd say. And again, you can go through and make sure you read these things. But the novel ends with Alyosha with the boys at Illyusha's stone, and his speech. Now, I think it's a beautiful speech, and remember, we've just heard those speeches during the trial. And there's been a lot in the novel that's sort of like a stage drama where it's just characters talking, right? Just characters talking. In some sense, this book is about speech, about the word, capital W. There's many different voices voicing many different arguments, and we've sort of seen them all pitted one against the other over the course of the novel. Now, Alyosha's speech here, I don't think is rhetorically that impressive. It's not like the speeches by the attorneys. And remember, he's still a pretty young guy. I don't know, he's 20 or 21, and he's not extremely well educated like Ivan was, and so he's not really eloquent, but the substance of what he's saying are the content of his speech is very beautiful, and I find it very moving, I think. And it's interesting and significant, I'd say, that this is the speech that gets the last word in the novel. Remember, because there's a lot of darkness in this book, a ton of darkness in this novel, and some parts of it were borderline depressing and felt threatening to our faith to read, almost, if you're not careful. But this speech gets the last word, and it's the character who's got faith who gets the last word. And you can hear echoes of the elder Zosima within the speech, I'd say, and I'll try to point some of those phrases out. And then you also get Alyosha's own developing worldview. And remember, he's all about active love. And that being a way to redeem things. So he remembers Illyusha. They all stopped silently at the big stone. Alyosha looked, and the whole picture of what Snegirov had once told him about Illyushka, crying and embracing his father, exclaiming, "Papa, Papa, how he humiliated you," rose at once in his memory. Something shook, as it were, in his soul. With a serious and important look, he gazed around at all those dear, bright faces of the schoolboys, Ilyusha's comrades, and suddenly said to them. So he's moved by a memory of Illyusha. So he's moved by compassion, I'd say. That's what tugs at his soul and prompts him to speech, to say something to these boys. "Gentlemen, I should like to have a word with you here on this very spot." The boys gathered around him and turned to him at once with attentive, expectant eyes. So they're devoted to him, and they're waiting to hear what he wants to say. And they're like middle school boys, which, if you teach middle school, I don't know if any of you do, middle school boys aren't always an attentive audience to an adult. That's probably fair to say. But how has Alyosha earned their respect? First of all, he's a good man. He's a good person. And second of all, he treats them, they're not equals, they're boys, and he's an adult, but he treats them not like little kids. And even you can hear it in the way he starts. "Gentlemen, I'd like to have a word with you." He treats them with seriousness, which is how you should treat people. And that inspires devotion in these boys, and then he can teach them something. "Gentlemen, we shall be parting soon. Right now I shall be with my two brothers for a while, one of whom is going into exile, and the other is lying near death. But soon I shall leave this town, perhaps for a very long time." Now, Dostoevsky died less than a year after he finished Brothers Karamazov, so 1881 is when he died. It appears that he had planned on writing a second novel about Alyosha out in the world. And remember, at the beginning of this one, he calls Alyosha his hero. Hint of that right here. "And so we shall part, gentlemen. Let us agree here by Ilyusha's stone that we will never forget, first Illyusheka, and second one another. We'll never forget one another. And whatever may happen to us later in life, even if we do not meet for 20 years afterwards, let us remember always how we buried the poor boy, whom we once threw stones at. Remember there by the little bridge, and whom afterwards we all came to love so much." So a couple things there. First of all, if you remember the boys throwing stones at Illyusha, Alyosha had no part in that. He just sort of walked by and saw it happen. But he humbles himself and includes himself in that point. We threw stones at him. Remember that. And again, that's part of treating these boys with seriousness, with charity, and all that. But hatred, and then we came to love him. So they were fighting and they came to be friends. The boy whom we love so much. So there's an idea of peacemaker there, like in the Beatitudes. Okay, and this whole thing starts with corporal work of mercy, because what are they doing? They're at his funeral. They're burying the dead. Remember how we buried the poor boy whom we once threw stones at. Bury the dead. That's active love. That's key to Alyosha's vision. And it comes from his elder, right? He learned it from his elder. And so we talk about mimesis too. There's healthy mediation, I'd say. And it's not quite the imitation of Christ, because the elder's a man, but but Alyosha imitates him in a way that's not going to lead to rivalry and violence. He was a nice boy, a kind and brave boy. He felt honor, and his father's bitter offense made him rise up. And so, first of all, let us remember him, gentlemen, all our lives. And even though we may be involved with the most important affairs, achieve distinction, or fall into some great misfortune, all the same, let us never forget how good we once felt here, all together, united by such a good and kind feelings as made us too, for the time that we loved the poor boy, perhaps better than we actually are. I love that idea, right? Let's never forget how good we felt here when united by good, kind feelings and by this act of corporal mercy. We were perhaps better than we actually are, because humanity's fallen, right? But when you live the gospel actively, and when you love actively, I think this is the point here. You transcend your fallen nature in some sense, and that starts with God, of course, right? Because you don't have faith on your own. It starts with God's call, but then you can go act on it, and be better than you are, right? And that's maybe why it feels good to do good things. My little doves, let me call you that, little doves, because you are very much like those pretty gray blue birds. Now, at this moment, as I look at your kind, dear faces, my dear children, perhaps you will not understand what I'm going to say to you, because I often speak very incomprehensibly. But still, you will remember and someday agree with my words. You must know that there is nothing higher or stronger or sounder or more useful afterwards in life than some good memory, especially a memory from childhood, from the parental home. You hear a lot said about your education, yet some such beautiful, sacred memory preserved from childhood is perhaps the best education. If a man stores up many such memories to take into life, then he is saved for his whole life. And if only one good memory remains with us in our hearts, that alone may serve someday for our salvation. That comes straight from the elder, I'd say. And it goes both ways. So a good memory can be a source, not a source of salvation, but a good memory can keep you on the right track, let's say, even if you become wicked. But a bad memory can corrupt you. And remember the elder talking about, well, how could I be responsible for the sins of all mankind if it's just me? Like, I haven't done every bad thing ever. And he says, but hold on, think about every person you pass in the street. Say you pass some child with a look of rage on your face, and the child notices it and remembers it and holds that image in their heart and grows up with it, and it's a corrupting force. So I think Alyosha's echoing his teacher here, his elder. Perhaps we will even become wicked later on. We'll even be unable to resist a bad action. We'll laugh at people's tears and at those who say, as Kolya exclaimed today, I want to suffer for all people. Perhaps we will scoff wickedly at such people. And yet, no matter how wicked we may be, and God preserve us from it, as soon as we remember how we buried Illyusha, how we loved him in his last days, and how we've been talking just now, so much as friends, so together by this stone, the most cruel and jeering man among us, if we should become so, will still not dare laugh within himself at how kind and good he was at this present moment. Moreover, perhaps just this memory alone will keep him from great evil, and he will think better of it and say, yes, I was kind, brave, and honest then. Let him laugh to himself. It's no matter. A man often laughs at what is kind and good. It just comes from thoughtlessness. But I assure you, gentlemen, that as soon as he laughs, he will say at once in his heart, no, it's a bad thing for me to laugh, because no one should laugh at that. Okay, and there's this transforming power of active love, again, I'd say. Remember what we were doing here, this good thing, burying the poor boy, and that will keep you from much evil later in your life. It certainly will be so, Karamazov. I understand you, Karamazov, Kolya exclaimed, his eyes flashing. The boys were stirred and also wanted to exclaim something, but restrained themselves, looking tenderly and attentively at the orator. So he's reaching them for sure. And Kolya is a very smart kid, remember? He's like 13 or something. But he doesn't believe, or he says he doesn't when we meet him in the middle of the novel. But at this point, he's almost looking like Alyosha's pupil, in the same way that Alyosha looked up to the elder, and that's interesting. And you might think that's a series of mediated relationships that look upward. So Kolia to Alyosha, Alyosha to the elder to God, or the elder to Christ. So that goes up, and like so many things in this novel, there's a balance to it, or there's a flip side to that, because we also have an inverted chain of mediators, maybe you could say, and Girard would call that deviated transcendence. So think Ivan's the master, Smerdyakov is his disciple, and Smerdyakov clearly looks up to Ivan and also hates him, right? Because it's always love and hatred with these things. But you go Smerdyakov to the master Ivan, and then who does Ivan talk to before he descends into madness? The devil, right? So there's a deviated transcendency. It's significant that the book ends with the chain pointing upward with Alyosha and Christ. Very significant. That's the last word. I'm speaking about the worst case, if we become bad, Alyosha went on. But why should we become bad, gentlemen? Isn't that true? Let us first of all and before all be kind, then honest, and then let us never forget one another. I say it again. I give you my word, gentlemen, that for my part I will never forget any one of you. Each face that is looking at me now, at this moment, I will remember, be it even after 30 years. Kolia said to Kardashov just now that we supposedly do not care to know of his existence. But how can I forget that Kardashov exists, and that he is no longer blushing now, as when he discovered Troy, but is looking at me with his nice, kind, happy eyes? Gentlemen, my dear gentlemen, let us all be as generous and brave as Illyusha, as intelligent, brave, and generous as Kolia, who will be much more intelligent when he grows up a little. And let us be as bashful, but smart and nice as Kardashov. But why am I talking about these two? You are all dear to me, gentlemen. From now on, I shall keep you all in my heart, and I ask you to keep me in your hearts, too. Well, and who has united us in this good, kind feeling, which we will remember and intend to remember always, all our lives? Who, if not Illyusha, that good boy, that kind boy, that boy dear to us, unto ages of ages? Let us never forget him, and may his memory be eternal and good in our hearts, now and unto ages of ages. Hopefully you can hear the liturgical language creeping in, or breaking into Alyosha's speech there. So unto the ages of ages, let his memory be before us unto the ages of ages. That's from Orthodox liturgy, I believe, Eastern Orthodox liturgy. But it's the same as in the Glory Be when we say now and forever, forever and ever, right? Because the Latin phrase is in saecula saeculorum, which means into the ages of ages, into the ages of ages. Okay, so again, liturgical language breaking into Alyosha's speech here, almost unconsciously, because he's seeped in the language of the church. Yes, yes, eternal, eternal, all the boys cried in their ringing voices, with deep feeling in their faces. Let us remember his face, and his clothes, and his poor boots, and his little coffin, and his unfortunate, sinful father, and how he bravely rose up against the whole class for him. Remember it was in the chapter, peasant women who have faith, I think, and there was that broken mother whose fourth son, or whose fourth child, her little boy, had died, and she talks about, I just see his little boots sitting by the bedside, and I hold his little belt or his sash, and I just break, and I can't handle it. We're back to that, right? And the elder gave her comfort. That wasn't really cheap comfort. He said, your grief is like in Luke's gospel, or Matthew's gospel, when Herod has the infants killed, right? Rachel weeping because her children are no more. So there's no comfort, but your sorrow, if you let it, and if you love, and if you have faith, will turn into joy, quiet joy eventually. Alyosha's echoing that sentiment. It's not a sentiment. No, he's echoing that reality, I would say. So we will remember, the boys cried again. He was brave, he was kind. Ah, how I loved him, exclaimed Kolya. Now, all the other kids look up to Kolya, just like Kolya looks up to Alyosha. So you can see how this imitative desire thing can go really bad, really evil, really south, or be very good and lead toward Christ. Ah, children, ah, dear friends, do not be afraid of life. How good life is when you do something good and rightful. And there's that's a hymn, right? How good life is when you do something good and rightful. So it can be terrible, and there's been a lot of terrible in the novel, and we all know about terrible and how life can be dismal and full of suffering. But how good it is when you do something good and rightful. And doing something good and rightful never depends on chance or your circumstances or what happens to be happening to you. You always have the choice to do good and do right. And then that's the thing that makes you happy. And that's what makes life good. I think that's all packed into that little statement there. Yes, yes, the boys repeated ecstatically. Karamazov, we love you, a voice which seemed to be Kardashov's exclaimed irrepressibly. He can't hold it back. We love you, everyone joined in. Many had tears shining in their eyes. Hurrah for Karamazov, Kolya proclaimed ecstatically. Ecstatically, right? That's like a heightened religious state where you're almost out of your mind. You're exalted, overcome by love, would be the way to say it. And memory eternal for the dead boy, Alyosha added again with feeling. Memory eternal, the boys again joined in. Now here's where the last little paragraph here, and here's the image or the idea the novel leaves us off with. So Kolya said early in the book he doesn't have faith. Karamazov, cried Kolya, can it really be true, as religion says, that we shall all rise from the dead and come to life and see one another again, and everyone, and Illyusha? Certainly we shall rise, certainly we shall see and gladly, joyfully tell one another all that has been, Alyosha replied, half laughing, half in ecstasy. Ah, how good that will be, burst from Kolya. Well, and now let's end our speeches and go to his memorial dinner. Don't be disturbed that we'll be eating pancakes. It's an ancient, eternal thing, and there's good in that too, laughed Alyosha. Well, let's go, and we go like this now, hand in hand. And eternally so, all our lives hand in hand. Hurrah for Karamazov, Kolya cried once more ecstatically, and once more all the boys joined in his exclamation. And that's the end. And I'll let the end of the book speak for itself there. But that's what we're left with. Faith and an affirmation of faith and joy, real joy, and closeness and togetherness and companionship in the face of sorrow and suffering and death. Right? They're at a funeral. But they find solace in their faith, which is real. It's not an idea anymore. And the joy is the evidence of that. And so I would say, if we go back to Ivan and Alyosha sitting in the tavern and the Grand Inquisitor, where Alyosha's only response is to kiss Ivan and leave it at that. He doesn't have words for it. That wins, weirdly enough, because Ivan's lying in bed, driven mad by his own ideas, and Dmitri's in exile, and every character, I would say, except for Alyosha and these boys who are following him, nothing's resolved for any of them. But we end with joy for Alyosha and his disciples, you might say, and that's a hopeful end through a long book. I mean, that's a long book with a lot of really bright and really dark passages. And that's how it ends. It ends in light, I'd say. Ends in hope. And in a promise of a resurrection. And that's that. So you should feel very good about, if you finished it, having finished this book. Again, it's not something I read till I was 22, and I think it's, if not the most important novel ever written, it's up there, and it doesn't get much much more profound, if not more fun to read. Okay, so like I said, we will return to this book for some kind of writing near the end of the semester, but we can leave it aside for now and get ready to read George Orwell, which will be a different, much different feel. So he's 20th century, right? And we're reading 1984, which you should have the book. And I think you'll enjoy it. Right? It's a dystopian novel. It's newer to me. You know, I've started it and I'm into it, but I never had read it. So I'm going to be spending my break getting very familiar with the novel and with Orwell in general. And I'm excited to think through it with you and see what we can learn. Now, before we read the novel proper, and what I want you to do over break, or you could think, just do it today, just knock these things out. I've linked you on RenWeb to two essays by George Orwell, both from 1946. They're both very short. And the first one is called Politics in the English Language. And so it's going to take you to this website, orwell.ru. It should just link you right to the article, but in case it doesn't, here's how you find it. So be looking at your screen. Politics in the English Language. Now you have to click English and then English again, and it just takes you right to this essay. Now read this one first. So the title is pretty self-explanatory, but this is a very, very good read and an important read, and I think you'll find it interesting. A couple highlights from it. So he points to the deliberate opaqueness of the political language of his day as one evidence of the decay of thought. So people don't think anymore, so they have to think in these scientific, bureaucratic, predetermined phrases and sort of piece them together. And then they're robots at that point, just spouting off propaganda. He has 6 great rules if you're writing, and these are worth thinking about, independent of Orwell. What am I trying to say? What words will express it? What image will make it clearer? Is this image fresh enough to have an effect? He talks a lot about metaphors that have become meaningless because they're overused. 5, could I put it more shortly? Have I said anything that is avoidably ugly? So those are great rules. Yeah, and it's quite an interesting read. He goes through the perversion of language for political purposes. And he's very much against totalitarianism, which you'll get a feel for as you read it. Now, the second article that you're going to be reading, or second essay you're going to be reading, is called Why I Write. Same year, 1946, and he's just giving a defense of himself as a writer, or an explanation of himself as a writer, which is really worth reading before we read 1984, so we can understand something about what he's up to. Now, there is one phrase in here that is really important, and it's going to be challenging for you. Like, I can already hear Charlie going, forget it, I'm not reading George Orwell if you said something like that. But you're going to read George Orwell, and you don't have to agree with him, but you have to engage him because he's a profound thinker. Now, he says straight out, every line of serious work that I've written since 1936 has been written directly or indirectly against totalitarianism. So that, good, against totalitarianism. And remember, Nazi fascism and Soviet communism are both totalitarianism on the left and on the right. So everything he's written is against that, and my guess is you'll probably be fine with that. The line that might give you trouble is that everything I've written is also for democratic socialism, as I understand it. Okay, so he had started as a communist revolutionary and basically changed changed. And he fought in the Spanish Civil War, and I think I got to do some more research and whatnot over break, but he dropped that at some point, and he actually spoke out fiercely against like Soviet communism, let's say. So he's not a communist, certainly, and he's flat out against totalitarianism of any kind. Now, when he says democratic socialism, the only thing I want to caution you against is, first of all, take him at his word. So Orwell is not a defender of like libertarian Tea Party, no government stuff. He's not that simple. He's too smart to be that simple of a thinker to say, no, we'd be better if there were no government. It's like, no, we wouldn't. And that's an easy way out. You can say that and tell yourself you're right, and then you don't have to do any more work. So he's not an apologist for like Tea Party ideas or alt-right stuff. So sorry if that's what you were looking for, but that's not what we're going to find. So he says he's for democratic socialism, everything he's written, as I understand it. Now that's key, because I don't think he means exactly the kind of democratic socialism that like Bernie's running on. So don't read that phrase, democratic socialism, and then freak out and turn off and say, I can't learn anything from Orwell, and he's anathema. Because then you're just doing what he's trying to defend us against, which is playing the perversion of language for political purposes game, because you're just taking a phrase, democratic socialism, and saying, nope. So take him at his word, and especially against totalitarianism. There's not many more important things you can do, whether you're on the left or the right. So we're going to read him because he's a genius, and 1984 is a book you need to engage with if you're going to be an educated person in the 21st century. So I'm looking forward to it. Again, read those essays by the time we're back from break, and then we'll have one or two more after break, and then we'll get into the novel, which you should have. So yeah, that's all I got for you. Enjoy your break, be safe, be smart, and all that, and enjoy the family time and everything, and we'll see you in over a week when we get back. All right, God bless.